Hello, everyone, and welcome to Growing Together, a gardening podcast with me, John Lamb, and Don Kinsler, a lifelong gardener and the North Dakota State University Extension horticulturist for Cass County. Don, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Love this time of year. I can't get enough of it. You know, the trees, shrubs, the landscaping, watching the perennial flowers. Our pots and planters are coming along good. And it's just, it's awesome to revel in everything. And this is why we garden here.
Yeah.
The long days produce just bounty, and I love it.
It is a great time for gardening. It's just a great time to get out there. And so far, you know, the weather has not been awful. It's been really pretty nice. And so it's just been nice to spend more time outside, isn't it?
It is. And I'm curious, do you ever think ahead already to next year? You know, things on your garden, you're thinking, okay, well, I can't do that this year, but next year. Yeah, So it's funny. I'm already planning next year. I mean, not because I want this year to go by, but I'm already thinking, let's see, those iris I probably should divide in August so that for next year they're going to look extra nice. So it's kind of fun. The seasons don't really end. They just kind of go into one after another. And so I'm already looking forward to next year after enjoying this year so good.
Yeah, we're going to be reconfiguring some garden spaces and kind of, you know, taking up a little bit of lawn to give us more garden space. So we won't be doing any planting in those spaces this year, but it's fun to like look at that area and think like, well, what else could we do there? What should we be planning for next year? And it is fun to think about that.
And I'm always amazed at the investment that we make in something this year, a perennial, and trees, shrubs are perennials. They come back each year. The investment that we make this year, such as fertilizing, good care, that shows up in the future years. The energy that we give to a tree, a perennial, you know, if I fertilize my rhubarb good this year, it's going to produce well next year. So these are all things that we build. And unfortunately, if we do some things that adversely affect our plants, trees, shrubs, that also is going to be carried into the future. And so that kind of leads us into today's topic.
Yeah, why don't you tell us a little bit about where we're going here?
The mystery of the murdered tree.
Dun, dun, dun. We should have a little Law and Order. Boom, boom.
Yes, the mystery of the murdered tree. Okay, when I first started writing the garden column for Forum Communications in 2013, I happened to be driving around, and it was one of the schools in the area. I'm not going to pick on which one,
right.
But it was one of the schools, and I noticed an ornamental crabapple that just didn't look good. It was a tree that I'm guessing had been planted maybe 7-8 years before. It had a good-sized trunk, but the canopy just didn't look good. It looked thinner. And so I got out of the vehicle, went and took a look, and at the base of the tree, where the trunk goes into the ground, the bark was all scratched up from mower and string trimmer. It was quite obvious. And so the bark was missing around. The tree wasn't dead, but it was like, man, when we cut into the bark like that, that cuts off the life support. You know, the tree trunk isn't dead. Right below that outer bark, the outer rough bark, that's kind of a protection. That's protecting what's inside of that. And inside of the old bark, the outer bark, inside of that is the cambium layer. That's the layer of growth cells, and also the phloem tissue. That's where things flow up and down, sap, water flow up and down within the tree. And if we're cutting into that, it cuts off the tree's life support. So anyway, I noticed that and I thought, oh man, shoot, this tree's being murdered. And so, well, the tree wasn't dead, and I wrote about the dangers of that. Well, anyway, I returned to that same location about 5 years later, and what I saw was about half of the tree had dead branches up and in it. So the tree's life support system was being cut off, and it was on a slow decline on its road to death. Well, I came back a couple years later to check on my tree, and it had been removed. And so, I felt so bad. You know, the mystery of the murdered tree, it wasn't too difficult to solve. It had been killed by us human, by things we do. And the foresters indicate that there is a higher percentage of trees killed by humans than there are by diseases and insects. Sometimes when something happens to a tree, it's going downhill or something, we focus, okay, what disease does it have? Or, what insects are attacking it? But very often it's things that we humans do that are adversely affecting these trees. And, when I mentioned to a perennial like my rhubarb, I fertilize it for future years too.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. But if during this growing season, if we're doing things that are hurting the trees, that is also going to follow up down the road. A lot of these things are cumulative problems. And so we're not just hurting it for this season. We can be creating a whole bank of problems that tree might have for the rest of its life. So anyway, that's kind of our topic for today. It's maybe not the cheeriest of topics, but yet if we can avoid doing these things to the tree, well, that's where the smiles come from.
Right.
We can avoid doing these things. And so there's kind of a whole list of things that we do to our trees that we shouldn't be doing to our trees.
Yeah.
And the first one of those is when we get a new tree, planting too deeply. Okay, well, how do you know how deep to plant a tree? Okay, when you buy a tree, it's easier to tell if you've bought a bare root tree. Some garden centers sell bare root trees that aren't in pots, bare root, and you can see the root system. Those are sold by some garden centers early in the season. They don't have a shelf life. They've got to be kept under refrigeration and moist. So you can't have a bare root tree to plant in the middle of July. You can have a potted tree because they have a shelf life. Okay, on a bare root tree, you can see the root system well and the trunk. So how deep to plant a tree? And this depth is really important. If you get it planted too deep, what we're finding is that trees that were planted too deeply 10 years ago, a sizable tree, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, they'll topple over. And we'll do a post-mortem and see, wow, this tree was planted too deeply, the trunk rotted, and it snapped off in a wind. Okay, so back to the how deep to plant a tree. Okay, on a bare root tree, take a look for you got the trunk and you got the root system. Look for the uppermost root, main root that comes off the trunk. That uppermost root should only be about an inch below soil surface when you're all done planting. Okay, that's called the flare root. A trunk tends to flare out on the bottom, and that first main root is called the flare root. So that should be just below soil surface. Now, on a potted tree, when you buy a potted tree, it's a little more difficult to find that flare root because, of course, there's soil around it. It's in a pot. And we can't assume that they were planted in the pot at the right depth. Okay, so the best way to look when you're looking at a potted tree, you get it home, you're wondering how deep to plant, how deep to dig the hole. First of all, look for the trunk flare. Okay, the bottom, you should be able to see that flared out portion. And then dig down in the pot, the soil a little bit. Look for that uppermost root, that flare root, and make sure that that's going to be only about 1 inch below soil surface. If a tree was planted too deeply in the pot, you may have to scrape off some of that soil. So don't just plant down in so that your soil is covering that potted soil because it might have been too deep. So how do you tell if a tree 10, 15 years down the road was planted too deeply, before it topples over? What we look for is if that tree goes down into the soil straight as a telephone pole with no flare as it enters the ground, that tree might have been planted too deeply. After the fact, there's not much you can do, 10, 15 years down the road, but at least tells you what might be going wrong. So on any tree that's been in place a while, you should see a slight flare, wider flare as that trunk is going into the ground. And you could even, dig down and see where that main root is because they continue to get bigger. So anyway, the importance of not planting too deeply. A related thing is making sure that when you plant a young tree, make sure that the roots aren't circling around. Now, on a bare root tree, it's fairly easy to just make sure you spread those out. Don't circle them around in the planting hole. On a potted tree, it's a little trickier because in a potted tree, most of those roots are probably going around in a circle. So take it out of the pot and gently tease those roots out apart. Yeah, it's going to disturb the roots a little, but that's okay. Gently pull those roots apart. You might even have to take a knife and cut some, but don't leave those roots circling around because after planting, they're going to stay in that same circular pattern. And so picture this. As the tree trunk enlarges, spreads outward, those circling tree roots get bigger, and pretty soon the two are touching, and those roots are right around the base of the trunk like a boa constrictor. And so I've seen trees after 10, 15 years where there's this big circle root embedded in the tree trunk, and it's choking off the good things in the tree, and the tree then dies. And what a disappointment.
Yeah.
I looked at one last year that was just a textbook case of that. Well, that brings up, as long as we're talking about newly planted trees, how often to water a newly planted tree? Because we can kill it by watering it too often. Sometimes we think, well, gosh, I don't want my newly planted tree to die, so
Right.
I'm going to make sure it has enough water. Well, watering every day can kill a new tree because it just can't get oxygen down the roots. So a good rule of thumb is when you plant a new tree, give it at least a 5-gallon bucket of water. Leave a little depression around so it'll hold the water, and then slowly pour on 5 gallons, and at least that much. That should be enough to settle the soil and get it off to a good start. And then a week later, maybe 7 to 10 days, depending on if we get rain, what the temperatures are. But so not every day, but maybe once a week, a good soaking with a 5-gallon bucket or so should do it. If you're having hot, windy days, well, maybe a couple of times a week.
Okay.
But we can't kill our trees with kindness like that. And so, okay, that leads us to trees that have been maybe in place for a little bit. And so how do we mow around a tree? Well, of course, it looks kind of shaggy if the grass is growing right up to a tree trunk. And those shaggy tufts of grass that grow right around a tree trunk, okay,
Yep.
How do you get rid of those? And of course, it could be tempting to take the mower and try to get right up next to that tree trunk to get rid of that shaggy tufts of grass that are growing. But a mower can really scrape up a tree trunk, not just a young tree, but I've seen older established tree trunks where the bark has been scraped with a mower hitting it. And that damage is cumulative. If even on an older tree, if I scrape a little bark this week's mowing, next week maybe scrape another little place, and that damage is cumulative. And eventually we're harming that tree trunk. On a very young tree where the bark is thinner, one gouge from a lawnmower or string trimmer, to get those ugly tufts of grass from around that tree, string trimmers, man, they can just totally decimate the bark, not only on young tender trees, but also on older trees. And so when we hit the bark of tree with a mower or a tree trimmer and scar it up like that, we're denting it in and we're affecting that cambium growth layer and the tissue that conducts water and sap up and down the tree. And those are right inside that tree trunk. Farther into the tree is a lot of support tissue. But the parts that are keeping that tree alive are right under that outer bark. So nick here, a cut there, over time, you're depleting that tree over time.
All right, let's take a quick little break. When we come back, we're going to talk more about tree care and how to keep your tree alive in the mystery of the murdered tree.
When you can't make it to City Hall or school board meetings, local journalists from Inforum.com will be there to report the facts and get your questions answered. Local news works for you. Stay up to date at Inforum.com.
All right, we're back with the mystery of the murdered tree, and the mystery was solved that the tree was killed by human error and human negligence. So we've been talking about some things, how to keep your trees healthy, how to keep your trees alive. We talked a little bit about at the end of the last segment about mowing too close and getting weed trimmers out there, and really where you nick up and you gouge the tree and really do a lot of damage that way. You've got a pretty good solution to that, and that's this pretty simple one, mulching.
Mulching, yes. And unfortunately, when I drive up and down boulevards on trees, I out of habit, I look at the base of the trees, and unfortunately, it's kind of sad. I see way too much damage to the base of trees, and they're not always going to outgrow that. But yeah, mulch. A fairly easy remedy. That makes mowing so easy. It's just mulch around the tree. That's going to be better for the tree, because actually lawn grass is a robber from trees, especially young trees. Lawn grass is heavy feeders, and that takes a lot of nitrogen and nutrients out of the soil. And some studies have actually shown that grass can exude some products that diminish trees. So the roots are actually maybe diminishing the tree's growth. So mulch is just a wonderful answer. Mulching around that tree. It'll be better for the tree. It'll get rid of the grass. And then also mowing is so easy. You just go around the ring of mulch with your lawnmower wheel, and it really works well. Now, when I'm mulching around a tree where there's already grass, we don't even need to dig the grass out. You could use landscape fabric. What I've found is just amazing is cardboard.
Okay.
I go to a recycle drop-off, get some flat cardboard, and then cut that into pieces, overlap them, and then work that around in a circular fashion, and then shredded mulch over that. So it hides the cardboard, but in the meantime, the cardboard shades out the grass. The grass just dies underneath. That'll be just fine, perfect. And then the mulch. Now, when you look up, how big of a circle and depth of mulch should it be? Sometimes you'll see the 3-3-3 rule. 3 feet wide, diameter 3 feet wide, 3 inches thick, and kept 3 inches away from the trunk. Very important. We don't want that mulch to be right onto the trunk of the tree. That can cause rotting. So we need an open space right next to that tree. So the 3-3-3 rule. And I remember when I wrote about that in one of the garden columns, old Professor Neil Holland, wonderful, just wonderful advice. He said, that's good, but he said, I'd do the 5-5-5. 5 foot diameter, the more the better, 5 foot diameter, 5 inches thick of the mulch, because he said that's going to settle to 3.
Yep.
Yeah, okay. So, but if you only put 3, it's going to settle for 1. Pretty soon you're going to have weeds growing, etc. So he said 5 inches would be better, and then keep it 5 inches away from the trunk. He said, human nature, if we say 5-5-5, maybe many of us might do 4. We might fudge a little down, but he said even if we end up with 4, that's better than the 3-3-3. So I've become an advocate of the 5-5-5 rule on that, and so it's better for the tree, and it simplifies the mowing so much.
There's another thing that you think about that. When a tree is planted, a lot of times we plant it with stakes to keep it from, it's happened with the trees that have been planted on our boulevard, that the wind will come along or something, the tree will settle maybe and it'll lean to one way or the other. Stakes are a good way to keep it upright. But you say that there's a window on how long you should leave the stakes on for.
There is. And generally, the foresters have indicated that the healthiest is just leave it on for one growing season, that first growing season. By then, it should have rooted in and established enough. And when you do stake a tree so that it won't be toppling in the wind. Allow it a little bit of movement, though. Don't stake it so tightly that it can't move at all. We don't want it, of course, naturally to bend over, but a little bit of movement is important to build the fibrous structure in the trunk. It'll make it stronger. So don't hold it as though it's going to run away on a person, but just, have it loose enough so it can be a little bit of movement, but not totally top over. So if your tree wraps have been on longer than a year, you can take them off. And be sure if a stake has been left on a long time, be careful, because some of the material that has gone around the trunk might actually be embedded. So, don't leave it on that long is the bottom line. Another thing, we talked about mulching with shredded bark. What about rock mulch? Rock mulch isn't actually the best mulch. It's not as tree friendly. You don't really see too many trees growing with rocks around them. I guess you do, growing out of the side of the Rocky Mountains or something. Yes. But for most of our home yards, shredded mulch, wood mulch, is more tree friendly. Rocks tend to heat up, on hot summers. It does get quite hot. And also heavy. A 5-gallon bucket of rocks is pretty heavy.
Right.
And so when placed around a tree over time, that really can compress the soil down. And also, I've seen cases where the rocks have become embedded in the tree. Once in the tree trunk. Once that the rocks kind of settle in place, they don't always expand outward as the trunk expands out. So I've seen declining trees where then a person examines the base and we've had to pry out the rocks that became embedded in the tree trunk. So, shredded mulch, much more tree friendly. And, another mentioning weed fabric. I use cardboard under ours. Weed fabric works too, but be sure if you have used weed fabric, every so often, maybe at least every year, make sure that weed fabric is expanding as the tree trunk expands. Some of those products lay firm enough that we've seen cases where the trunk expands and it expanded out beyond the weed fabric. So the weed fabric is now embedded in the tree trunk, which isn't a good case, and you've had to almost try to physically pull it out of that.
Yeah.
And if it's wedged in there, it can't always be done. The last item that I'd maybe mention on things that we need to avoid, so we aren't killing our trees, is when we do pruning. And of course, the best time to do pruning on leafy type deciduous trees is in early spring before they leaf out. But don't leave stubs. When you're pruning a branch, small branch, don't leave a dead stub. Cut back to either kind of somewhat flush with another branch or to where there's a bud coming out. And when you do cut, there's a little bit of a ring of tissue. I think in a previous podcast we might have discussed pruning. So there's a little ring of tissue where that branch would meet the other branch or the main tree trunk. There's a little ring of tissue, and leave that intact because that's where the healing tissue is, the healing cells that will seal that over. So we don't want to leave little stubs because that's just a spot where rot will enter and that can enter the tree, but we don't want to make it totally flush so that we're kind of injuring the main trunk or the main branch. So leave that just a slight, we're just talking maybe 1/8 of an inch out where that growth ring is. It's one of those things where you kind of know it when you see it. You're pruning and you're cutting off a little side branch that goes to the main trunk. You'll say, oh, sure, there I see. There's that little ring of tissue, that collar of tissue, and we leave that intact.
Yeah, so a lot of good pointers that again, this isn't, if you have a tree, especially like a younger tree and you want to take care of it, this is just a lot of simple preventative things to know about, just things not to do. So we're not saying that you have to go out and buy all this expensive thing to keep your tree healthy. These are just really simple things that you do yourself to help your tree, you give it its best chance of surviving.
Because trees are a long-term investment.
Yeah.
Trees, most species, unless it's a fast-growing, shorter-lived tree, but most tree species, we're talking about lifespans of 100 years easily, maybe more, maybe many, many more. And it's a shame to plant that tree and then be doing things to it that are going to cause it to die, 5, 10 years, 15 years down the road and not make it to that lifespan. And so it's fascinating to give it the care that it needs and don't do the things that are going to kill it. And so the mystery of the murdered tree is oftentimes us humans doing things we shouldn't be doing.
It's a teachable lesson.
It is. Oh, and there's nothing more fun than planting a tree and watching that tree thrive. My daughter planted an acorn when she was about 4 years old.
Okay.
And we watched that tree grow into a big, fine oak tree.
Really? That's great.
About 25 years down the road.
Yeah.
And at the previous place that we used to live. But yeah, it's a investment, and there's nothing more rewarding than actually watching that tree thrive and to decades down the road say, we planted that tree.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Well, if people have questions about tree care or just anything in their garden, whether they have questions, concerns, or just want to show off and brag a little bit, what's the best way to reach you?
Send me an email, donald.kinsler, Kinzler, @ndsu.edu. And let's hear it for all of our trees. They're awesome.
Yes. All right, Don, you take it easy, and we'll talk to you later.
You too, John, and have a good week, everyone.